Hello and good evening. Tonight's gentle journey takes us to Antarctica's greatest cover-up, ancient maps, secret bases, and the 1959 treaty. Lower the volume, rest your eyes, and let the past be your lullaby. If this brings you peace, consider liking and subscribing only if it truly helps. And share in the comments where you're joining us from and the hour there. Now, lights down, a soft fan if you have one, and let's begin our walk through history at the farthest edge of the Atlas, where meridians draw tight and paper turns white. A continent waits like a blank page. Antarctica is larger than Europe and buried beneath miles of ice, an entire world sealed shut. When early sailors finished sketching the coasts of Africa and the Americas, they left a pale vacancy at the bottom of the map, as if the Earth were unfinished or as if something important had been carefully erased. Even now, what we learn arrives in measured tones and carefully framed pictures. You can feel it in the way official reports smooth their sentences and how photographs prefer horizon lines to details. A continent in the open and yet somehow always behind a veil. What sets Antarctica apart isn't only its cruelty winds that plunge from the high interior like cold avalanches, temperatures that turn breath to needles, months when the sun either refuses to set or refuses to rise. It is the quiet. There are no native peoples here, no old villages, no inherited names for mountains passed along in fireside stories. The continent has research stations, but no cities, visitors, but no citizens. In 1959, a remarkable promise was inked. The land would be used only for peaceful purposes. No armies, no nuclear tests, no fresh claims of empire. In an era that armed itself to the teeth, humanity stepped back from this one white threshold and, with rare agreement, said not here. And yet the actors who visit are anything but ordinary. Admirals and ministers zip themselves into borrowed parkas. Spiritual leaders bless the horizon. Astronauts with moon-dusted reputations step out onto blue ice. Cameras click, hands are shaken, and then the guests fly home saying little. Scientists overwinter in steel-sided modules, their windows rimed with hoarfrost. Their work is real and often heroic, drilling meters down through ice that holds the breath of ancient skies, tracing the faint scars of vanished forests and seas. Still, by the time their findings reach us, they feel sifted. We hear of penguins and ozone, of ice cores that exhale centuries, and not always the parts that make the mind stumble and the heart race. The treaty's language is clear, peaceful use, open science, no new territorial claims. But treaties are also curtains. They both reveal and conceal. Antarctica's status as no one's land makes it everyone's subject and nobody's hometown. So the questions sharpen. Why did rivals who wrangled over islands and oil fields agree to such restraint here? What makes our species the one that measures, fences, mines, and taxes leave a continent largely untouched? Is it only the cost and the cold? Or is there something about the ice itself that invites silence? What story sleeps beneath that white lid? And who, if anyone, has already peeked tonight? We won't argue for a single answer. Instead, we'll walk softly across the record the ice keeps and peel back layers that have frozen together. We'll begin with an idea older than discovery, the imagined southern land that philosophers said must exist to balance the world. We'll follow the sledges and ships of the heroic age, when men traded warm rooms for frostbite and turned blank map space into human grief and glory. We'll examine the fossils and coal that insist this was once green. We'll meet puzzling old maps that appear to remember a coastline no one had seen. We'll step into the Cold War, when official missions and their actual scale did not quite match. We'll glance at satellite images that tempt us to see pyramids in mountains and doors in shadows. Each stop a tile, together a mosaicked paradox. Begin by imagining a scale. The ice sheet is a continent-sized library, shelves stacked a mile tall, every layer holding a winter. Snow falls, presses the years beneath it, turns to fern, then to glass-clear ice, trapping in tiny bubbles the breath and dust of vanished ages. Drill down and you pull up a transparent ledger ash from far volcanoes, pollen from forests that grew when dinosaurs browsed, the faint signatures of warmings and coolings that made seas climb and retreat. It is geology and memory at once, the Earth's diary, written in a language of crystals and air. The ice preserves ruthlessly. It also hides ruthlessly. There's nowhere else like it. And then there's the hush. On most continents, the story is loud markets, rails, highways, and the ordinary friction of neighbors. Here the narrative floats over bedrock we cannot quite see. Ask a pilot who has landed on blue ice runways to describe the silence, and you'll often get a small smile. It isn't an absence. They'll say, it's a presence. The wind has a body, the cold has weight. The light is a page that turns slowly and never tears. The nearest town is an ocean away. On still nights, you can hear the ice itself shift and sigh as if the continent were rolling in its sleep. Our human chapter at the bottom of the world began with faith in balance. Long before wooden hulls nosed into pack ice, thinkers imagined Terra Australis incognita, a southern counterweight to keep the globe stable and moral, a land that simply had to be there because symmetry felt right. Sailors later mistook islands and capes for its ragged edge. Only during the heroic age, when sledges scraped over wind-carved ridges and ships groaned in pack ice, did we admit the truth this was not merely ocean and bergs, but a true continent, wildly high and thick with time. The 20th century brought radios and wars and sharp-edged ambition, and Antarctica moved from the margin of maps into the center of strategy and science. It is tempting, on a night like this, to rush toward the sensational. We will not. We will move in widening circles from the ideas that gave Antarctica a place in our imagination, to the boots and sails and tragedies that fixed it on our charts, to the instruments that now see through ice, and the rules that decide who may look. We will hold myths gently because even when they miss, they record the shape of our longing. We will respect the mainstream explanations because they are hard-won, tested in frost and darkness. Between them runs a narrow path, and that is where our story will walk. Think again of the treaty, ink drying in 1959 as superpowers glared across oceans. In that season, nations agreed about at least one square of the chessboard: peaceful use, shared research, no new claims. It is hard not to admire such restraint. It is just as hard not to wonder what calculations lay beneath it. Perhaps it was prudence. No one wanted the cost of garrisoning a continent so hostile. Perhaps foresight, the value of a planetary laboratory where weather, ocean, and climate could be read without the smoke of war. Perhaps both, perhaps more. Either way, Antarctica became something rare, a place the world decided to keep quiet. As our walk unfolds, we'll follow charts whose southern margins once curled with sea monsters, then meet the men who traded myth for frostbite. We'll set a kettle on a station hot plate and read, in the ascending esteem, the faint script of carbon from ice ages past. We'll consider a Renaissance map that seems to sketch a coastline hidden beneath modern ice and ask why such curiosities persist. We'll watch governments mount enormous expeditions and then hurry home, and we'll ask why satellites sometimes leave blank squares where curiosity most wants to land, not to prove a theory, but to listen for pattern in the long, cold echo. If you're listening in the dark, perhaps with a fan whispering like a distant katabatic wind, you're already tuned to the right register. This is a story that prefers quiet. The continent itself encourages humility. It resists certainty and punishes swagger. It stores, in its clear stacked pages, a ledger of all the climates the earth has worn, and it will outlast us. No one owns it, no one is born there, and yet it may hold chapters of our past and drafts of our future. The cover looks blank, the book is anything but. So we begin where explorers and dreamers always began, with questions. Why does a land so large remain beyond the usual games of conquest? What pact, practical, principled, or fearful, keeps the lid closed? What might wait beneath only rock, ice, water, and a slow breath of climate, or something that brushes the edge of legend? We promise no revelations tonight, only a careful reading of the record and the company of wonder as we turn the first cold page. We open the old atlas to a place that did not yet exist, except in the human need for balance. Long before any keel cut the pack ice seas, philosophers imagined a counterweight, in the far south, a land that would keep the world from tipping, as if nature herself set a second hand upon the scale. They named it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. It wasn't discovered, it was deduced. If there was bulk in the north, surely there must be ballast in the south. The Greeks gave the idea its earliest frame. Pythagoras and later thinkers argued for a spherical earth and, by extension, for regions unseen. Aristotle wrote of frozen zones girdling the poles. Centuries later, the scholar Claudius Ptolemy spread a great southern continent across the edge of his geography. Not from eyewitness, but from balance, the known needed the counter-known. On those parchment worlds, Terra Australis existed because the mind required it. Echoes sounded far from the Mediterranean. In Chinese cosmographies, writers occasionally hinted at far southern realms. Nanji, the southern extremity, names that feel like distant bells rather than destinations. Maritime lore from the Indian Ocean spoke of waters that grew cold and fog-bound below familiar monsoon routes. Medieval Islamic geographers kept the possibility alive as they mapped a globe tied together by trade winds. None of these traditions claim discovery. All keep the southern thought warm. When medieval Europeans inked their Mappae Mundi, the southern quarter often received a lavish wash of color. Where data failed, ornament arrived, serpents in surf, headless men with faces in their chests, banners that read marvels. Portolan sea charts stayed closer to fact, but the grand world maps preserved the myth. A counter-continent was painted along the bottom margin, like gilt on a page, less a coastline than a comfort. Then the age of daring arrived, and Terra Australis turned from theorem to quarry. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Portuguese caravels felt their way down Africa's flank. Spanish galleons crossed the Atlantic, and Dutch and English hulls shouldered into latitudes that a stiffened breath. Magellan found a strait and named the land beyond it Tierra del Fuego after the watchfires on shore. At home, many decided that this fiery rim must be the northern edge of the Great South. Later, Tasmania, New Zealand, and the island maze off Cape Horn were stitched to the same dream, as if they were fringes of one vast shore. Empires needed spice, gold, and glory, and a whole land, so they thought, promised all three. Push a little farther, the journals say in essence, and the coast will soften. But the Southern Ocean played a colder game. Pack ice gathered like an army in winter quarters. Bergs ground their teeth against wooden hulls. Fog fell in sudden, heavy veils. Men shivered, drew charts with cramped hands, and went home certain only of this: the South would cost more than it gave. Not all the memories came from Europe. Across the Pacific, Polynesian navigators, masters of swell and star, had peopled the ocean with their own careful courage. In their histories runs the word Hawaii, a homeland and origin that later tellings sometimes placed far to the south. In the Andes, colonial chroniclers recorded that the Inca spoke of pale strangers from a frozen land, or of teachers who came and went with a catastrophe. In Patagonia, tales described people of unusual height at the ends of the earth. Whether metaphor or memory, these stories sketched a southern presence at the very edge of the world's imagination. By the 17th century, Terra Australis had hardened into habit. Globes displayed its gentle arc. Schoolmen accepted it as the decor of a rational universe. Sailors used it as daydream during calms. Yet hard experience began to dent the ideal. Ships that rounded Tierra del Fuego saw not a welcoming shelf of green land, but seas that went on and on. New Zealand proved islands, not a promontory. Tasmania, too, stood apart. The great Southland receded each time a mast approached, like a mirage that kept its distance the closer you walked. Prudent voices admitted what many suspected: the South, if it existed, would not match the grand sweep painted in the mind. Still, the idea refused to vanish. It could not be erased by fact because it had been drawn by desire. The symmetry argument, so persuasive to scholars, was a confession of taste. We prefer the world balanced, and when it is not, we imagine it so. Painted marvels at the map's edge were less about zoology than psychology. Keep fear and wonder where the eye can admire them. And the Pacific, Andean, and Patagonian stories did their own work, making the South feel sacred, or at least charged, a place where origin stories and endings might overlap. It is hard to overstate how that absence worked on the European mind. Most places had names with obligations, kings and priests, languages and fields. The far South carried only surmise. In coffee houses, merchants traced routes with their fingers and guessed at profits. In libraries, scholars wrote long sentences about probability. On the docks, crews signed on for wages that read like bribes, knowing that each degree south would grow more costly. Blank space is a powerful recruiter. Here the paradox of history comes clear. A beautiful mistake, held long enough and widely enough, can generate truth. Belief in the southern continent financed voyages. and the wake lines of those voyages crossed waters no European had charted. Error-raised sails, filled logbooks, trained eyes, and from that training came a new sight in the 18th century, not only floes and bergs, but the stubborn outline of land beneath them, a hint that the imagined South had, in a way, called the real one into view. That is where our story will turn next, to the men who stitched their names into the ice before we step onto the floes with the crews who went south in wool and nerve. Give the idea its due. Terra Australis. Incognita was a wrong answer to a right question. How do we balance what we know? And like many wrong answers, it did the world a favor. It kept curiosity warm through long winters of ignorance. It lured ships into high latitudes, where the real continent lay hidden. It trained minds to expect that the edge would, at last, give way to truth. Hold an old globe in lamplight, and the painted South still catches the eye. Those grand, wrong curves tug at a nostalgia for the age when belief was allowed to be useful. Perhaps that is why Antarctica retains a whisper of legend even now that aircraft can cross it in hours. It was born in the mind long before it was met by the body. Remember that when we follow Cook's wake and, later, the sledges of the heroic age across the white, whenever a boot cracks frost or a sextant lifts to a winter sun, an idea is walking beside them. The map's southern margin begins to stiffen into fact with a wake line and a pair of ships scudding under skies the color of pewter. James Cook's second voyage, 1772 to 1775, stitched long curves through latitudes no European had yet endured. He crossed the Antarctic Circle and then crossed it again, driving his vessels farther into water thick with drift ice, charting fog, cold, and silence. What he found was not a green continent to balance the known world, but a palisade of pack and berg, ice stretching from horizon to horizon like a wall built by weather itself. Cook turned pages in his journal with numbed fingers and wrote the verdict that would be repeated for decades. Whatever lay beyond the ice would be hostile to life and worthless for commerce. And yet, as happens so often, a dismissal became an invitation. The very refusal of the South, its blankness, its danger-sharpened appetites. If there was nothing to trade, there was still everything to learn, and the pride of a nation could be measured in miles of white endured. Cook did not cite the continent, but he proved its presence negatively, as a sculptor reveals form by carving away. Sea temperatures, floating ice, and the behavior of birds spoke of land somewhere beyond the steel blue barrier. Behind his stern trailed a new profession of men sealers and whalers who went for profit rather than proof. Their small, tough vessels began to haunt the sub-Antarctic islands that Cook had sketched into European memory, South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, and in that brutal economy, the South entered the ledger. The slaughter was industrial and swift. Rookeries that had taken centuries to grow were emptied in seasons. The bones of that rush are part of Antarctica's preface, the promise of gain, drawing human risk into latitudes where risk ruled. The 19th century brought a different rhythm. Bursts of audacity is separated by long winters of thinking. In 1820, 3 almost simultaneous sightings claimed first contact with the continent's true edge. The Russian Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen recorded an ice shelf confronted by what he took to be land, the British officer Edward Bransfield sketched a portion of coastline now folded into the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. The American sealer Nathaniel Palmer, young and uninvited by the Academy, nosed his sloop into waters crowded with icebergs and returned with a tale of a mountainous shore. The debate over which gaze first met the continent is more than a footnote. It shows how Antarctica entered history not as a trophy of one flag, but as a convergence of hunger's imperial, commercial, and curious arriving at the same white door. A year later came the first disputed step. John Davis, a sealer out of Connecticut, wrote that in 1821 he and a handful of men landed briefly in Hughes Bay, set their boots upon rock, and returned quickly to their boat. The note in his log is spare, almost embarrassed, and historians have quarreled over its meaning, whether Davis truly stood on continental ground or only on an offshore islet. The claim hints at how landfall in Antarctica would differ from the staged flourishes of other ages. There were no crowds, no speeches, no garlands, only wind, a quick look, and retreat. Even when expeditions carried science as their banner, survival wrote the rules. James Weddell, sailing in 1823, pushed southward into the immense sea that now bears his name until the pack relented and a clear lane opened like an unlikely blessing. He retched anew furthest south and then turned back with the discipline that would define the wisest of polar travelers go far, but come home. In the 1830s and 40s, national voyages layered the map with bolder lines. Dumont d'Urville of France named Adélie Land for his wife, drawing a human tenderness across a savagely inhospitable shore. Charles Wilkes led the United States exploring expedition along a ragged, ice-haunted coast and returned to a messy controversy over whether he had truly traced a continuous continental margin. And James Clark Ross, quiet, stubborn, and patient, found the sea and shelf that bear his name, and a pair of volcanoes that seemed to breathe Erebus and terror, black cones shouldering into a light that never softened. He sailed his ships to the very brink of the ice barrier and wrote, with a sailor's respect, about a frontier that did not merely resist but refused. These were not full conquests. They were careful thefts of a certainty. From a place that disliked being known, the instruments packed aboard magnetometers to trace the Earth's invisible lines. Theodolites, to slice angles out of wind, were as much talismans as tools. They told men where they stood within a globe newly understood as a web of fields and forces. To fix the southern lights with a number, to tie needle quirks to latitude, felt like placing a pin in the map of a capricious sky. In this way, the South taught science humility. Measures were made in cold, recorded with cramped hands, and carried home in damp notebooks that smelled of oil and seal meat. Between these formal expeditions, the sealing grounds wrote their own grim ledger. Vessels wintered accidentally when pack ice closed without warning. Some were crushed and sank in minutes, the sound like a church collapsing. Survivors camped on ice floes, nursing blubber fires, eating penguin meat, and hoping their berg would drift north before they ran out of stories to keep each other warm. Fatalism flourished alongside nerve. The Antarctic did not hate men, it simply did not notice them, and that was worse. By the last years of the 19th century, the preface had been written. The line between rumor and coastline had hardened. The perimeter was sketched. What remained was the interior, the blank center where compasses failed and maps fell silent, the place Cook had judged useless. Here, ambition and method would meet on skis and sled runners. Shore parties had learned to build depots, to read their snow's moods, to trust dogs more than engines. The technologies of patience canvas, oak, pemmican, furs proved wiser than the technologies of pride, and a generation of men grew up with childhood shelves filled with the journals of Ross and D'Urville and Wilkes, volumes that smelled of dust and sounded like drums. Their dreams bent south. If we are fair to Cook, we will keep both halves of his legacy in view. He warned of barrenness, and yet, by making inaccessible famous, he invented a theater in which endurance could become a virtue on its own. The South, as a moral test, is an 18th century gift to the 20th. To go knowing there was little to gain, but the act of going, to measure success not in gold or trade winds, but in taut knots of shared hardship. This is a new calculus of worth, and Antarctica became its proving ground. There is, too, the quiet work of correction. The grand, swooping Terra Australis of earlier maps had been erased, but slowly, as if human pride required a decent interval between confession and amendment. Every added cape and sound implied an apology to the idea that once filled the margin. The new outline, jagged, severe, honest, taught a lesson we keep relearning. The world is under no obligation to satisfy the geometry of our wishes. Stand now at the close of the 19th century and listen, from Norway, from Britain, from the dominions that bent around the planet. Cables and letters whisper of plans. Provisions are listed in tidy columns, fur boots, canvas tents, flags folded flat to save a space. Funds are begged from governments and donors. Dogs are purchased, trained, and loved. Men study the tricks of wind-hardened snow, the ways it hides its fractures, the sound it makes the instant before it yields, and on kitchen tables and in chart rooms. Lines are drawn toward the center like arrows toward a target no one has yet touched. The race, when it begins, will be framed as a contest between nations, and it will be that, but it will be something else as well, a test of ideas about how to move through a world that will not forgive a single mistake. One school will honor craft learned from people who have lived with ice for millennia. Another will trust to modern engines and the stubbornness of gentlemen. One will calculate margin. Another will pray for luck. We know now how those choices will play out, and we will follow them in their turn. For the moment, stay a little longer in the wake of Cook and Ross, where patience learned its slow grammar and the edge of the continent hardened from rumor into shore. The century turns, and the white interior stops being a rumor and becomes an invitation. The margin is charted now, a collar of coasts and shelves and volcanic sentinels, and the maps all point inward to a target no one has touched. Men who grew up reading Ross and Waddell and Wilkes draw their own lines with blunt pencils across kitchen tables and wardrooms. The heroic age opens like a door swung wide in winter, a rush of cold, and then the quiet work of choosing how to move through it. Roald Amundsen chooses simplicity. He has studied people who live with ice rather than visited the Inuit in the far north, and he trusts what they know: dogs, skis, seal fur, and margin. He means, at first, to claim the North Pole, then quietly alters course when news arrives that others have already planted that flag. In 1910, he sails the small Strong Fram south and slips into the Bay of Whales, a low bight in the Ross Ice Shelf where the barrier's leap can be climbed without heroics. There he builds Framheim, a snug, snow-buried warren, and turns winter into rehearsal. Depot parties stitch food and fuel into the plane like beads. Clothing is cut and recut until it screams nothing, only warmth. Sledges are planed so thin they seem to weigh less if you look away. When the sun returns, Amundsen sends out a false start, learns the snow's early spring moods, and comes back without shame. He waits a breath longer. Then, in October 1911, he and 4 companions, Olav Bjalland, Helmer Hansen, Sverre Hassel, and Oscar Wisting, set out for real, low and fast. A caravan so clean it looks like a line drawn by a careful hand. Their method is unromantic and superb. Dogs run, men ski, distances fall. They climb through the Queen Maud Mountains by the Axel Heiberg Glacier, a route no one else has imagined, and lay down cairns so close together that missing the path home would require intent. On 14th December 1911, they reach a place that is nothing but a coordinate and make it human by naming it Polheim, home of the pole. They raise a tent, leave inside a letter to King Haakon and another for the rival they know cannot be far behind, and turn back with the same steadiness that brought them there. Their faces, when they return to Framheim, are burned brown, their dogs, thinned and honored, are curled in the snow. Efficiency, rarely a word that stirs the blood, has here saved it. Robert Falcon Scott, by contrast, carries 2 burdens, science and the story of England. His Terra Nova expedition, 1910-1913, is a tapestry of Ames magnetism, geology, a mobile, modern push to the pole, and the practical difficulties of keeping all these threads from tangling. The motor sledges he brings for modernity refuse the cold and die early. The ponies he has chosen for power sink to their chests in drift and cannot bear the plateau. Even so, there are triumphs of a different register. In the long dark, the zoologist Edward Wilson leads Apsley Cherry Garrard and Bertie Bowers on a nightmarish winter march to collect emperor penguin eggs, a scientific errand so hard Cherry later names it the worst journey in the world. Worn raw into a book that will outlast him, Scott's southern thrust tightens to a tragic, luminous core. After weeks of man-hauling sledges across the Beardmore Glacier and the vastness beyond, the final 5, Scott, Wilson, Bowers, Captain Lawrence Oates, and Petty Officer Edgar Taft Evans crest to the pole on 17th of January 1912 and find Amundsen's tent waiting like a calm verdict. The photographs taken there show men trying to arrange their faces around disappointment. They take a bearing, plant their own flag, and begin the long arithmetic of return, 5 bodies paying out their strength mile by mile. Evans weakens early. A fall, frostbite, and malnutrition unravel him, and he dies near the foot of the Beardmore. Oates, frostbitten and gangrenous, knows he has become the weight the others cannot afford to carry. On the morning of his 32nd birthday, he steps from the tent into a killing wind with a sentence England will embroider into memory. I am just going outside and maybe sometime the lost 3 press on, fighting cold, hunger, and the spring that comes late. 11 miles short of One Ton Depot, a storm nails their canvas to the ice for days. Scott writes his letters in a tidy hand that never slips, even as breath grows thin, to his wife, to friends, to the nation he has served with a kind of faith. For God's sake, look after our people. When a search party finds them months later, the tent is a small white chapel, and the journals inside a liturgy of endurance and failure braided tight. Between those poles of victory and loss moves a third figure who will become the South's patron saint of survival. Ernest Shackleton is remembered less for possession than for the art of keeping men alive where they should have died. He has already pushed far Nimrod, 1907, Zabor 9, stopping within 97 miles of the pole at 88 degrees 232 S. When he launches the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition in 1914, a plan both audacious and tidy to cross the continent from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea via the pole. While a second party lays depots from the other side, the sea has other ideas. His ship, Endurance, becomes a toy in the pack and then a prisoner, driftwood in a slow motion. For 10 months, the men live in a wooden ark tilted by ice. Then, with a series of groans like the earth remembering something, the floes crush her and she dies beneath them. The crew camps on the Flow Ocean Camp, then Patience Camp, names that are both maps and prayers. When the ice breaks at last, they take to 3 open boats and fight toward Elephant Island, a black knuckle of rock and glacier, uninhabited and utterly wrong, and somehow the right place to land. What follows is a seam of legend. Shackleton selects 5: Frank Worsley, the Wizard of a Sextant; Tom Crean, who carries luck like an extra heart; Timothy McCarthy, John Vincent, and Harry McNish, the carpenter whose hands stiffen life back into wood, and they climb into the James Caird, a 22-foot boat raised, braced, and decked by McNish into a thing that can survive what it should not. They aim for South Georgia, 800 miles across a tantruming ocean. For 2 weeks, they ride and are ridden by waves the size of churches. Worsley snatches sights of the sun through rags of cloud and threads a course no one has any right to find. They make land as wrecked as men can be and still be moving. The island's whaling stations sit on the wrong coast, so Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean shoulder into the interior, crossing glaciers and mountains no one has mapped, guided by the simplest line toward the smell of oil and the sound of a whistle. They arrive at a Stromness smeared with soot and hope. The manager stares as if at ghosts. The world returns. It takes months and multiple attempts. But Shackleton comes back for his men on Elephant Island with a Chilean ship, the Yelcho, and takes them all home. None of the Endurance crew is lost. It becomes a parable that travels well, that leadership is a kind of weather that can be made. This, then, is the braid the South offers the world at the height of the heroic age, Amundsen's clarity, Scott's sacrifice, Shackleton's guardianship. 3 answers to the same white question. 3 philosophies of risk and care. The differences matter, and so do the agreements. All 3 respect the arithmetic of distance and food. All 3 discover that the ice forgives nothing. All 3 make their followers feel that the work has a meaning beyond flags and headlines. That is why the journals sound like prayers. They turn the logistics of pemmican into a catechism, the tally of dogs and miles into psalms. In their pages, we can hear a new human tone take hold, steadfast, chastened, ambitious in a quieter key. and from their wake rises another hunger, softer voiced, but just as relentless, to read the continent not as a page for courage, but as a book of the earth. The expeditions bring back rocks from nunataks and the edges of glaciers. And in those stones, geologists hear warmth where we see white, forests where we see ice. The hero's age does not end so much as deepen. Flags snap in the wind, but cores of ice will soon be lifted like candlesticks from the deep, and the continent will begin to speak about time. For now, close the tent flaps on the last campfire and let the dogs circle into sleep. Out on the shelf, the wind writes and rewrites its single story. In the morning, men will lift harnesses and shoulder traces, and the line will move south again. But the nature of the journey has already shifted. The blank at the center has been touched. What lies beneath it, the fossils, the air of other ages, the locked lakes will ask a different kind of bravery. The flags come down and the notebooks stay open. After the age of planting colors in the snow, the continent begins to answer slower questions. What is this place really? Beneath its white disguise, Scotsmen die with stones in their sled fossils of glossy, veined leaves they have insisted on hauling back from the Beardmore Glacier, so that even their tragedy points a finger into deep time. The message is plain enough to read through frost. Antarctica was not always a synonym for cold. It once rustled, handful by handful. Evidence emerges like old letters found in a wall. Black seams of coal banned the trans-Antarctic mountains, compressed forests from a world that knew long summer light. In sandstone pockets, there are trunks turned to stone and the crisp lace of fern fronds. In the shales, impressions of southern beech and other plants that do not grow where the sun barely lifts. Some of the wood still carries rings, proof of winter and a spring in a latitude now locked to night for months. Fossils of Lystrosaurus, the stubborn little beaked creature that walked the earth through catastrophe, turn up here too, along with dinosaurs with improbable names, a meat-eater crowned with a crest, Cryolophosaurus, and a long-necked vegetarian, Glacialosaurus, both from an age when reptiles breathed air sweetened by ferns and conifers on land anchored closer to warmth. The stones say what the maps later confirm for a geological heartbeat. Antarctica belonged to a family of continents. Gondwana fitted edge to edge, like broken ceramics remade. Africa, India, Australia, South America, and this far south slab once shared soil and rivers. Plants and animals wandered without ships or miracles. Their fossils now lie like matching footprints on coasts divided by whole oceans. When Gondwana fractured and plates drifted, Antarctica was set adrift toward the pole. The planet itself conspired to seal it off. Gateways opened the Tasmanian Passage between Australia and the South, the Drake Passage near the tip of South America, and a new river of water began to race around the continent without interruption. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current is a moat made of ocean a cold, encircling belt that keeps warmth out and locks cold in, climatic doors shut. The green land blinked and woke under glass. Even so, the shift from forest to ice is not a neat line on a calendar. The layers say there were stutters, warm spells interrupting the great freeze interludes of milder air long after the continent had assumed its lonely latitude. Sediments from the margins carry pollen that has no business being there if the cold were simple and forever. The Earth has rhythms. We are latecomers to the dance. The greatest archive is not in rock, but in lightest work, a snow that never quite melts. Each year, the continent breathes a cloud to the ground, a fall of crystals so fine you could brush them away with a mitten. Weight presses weight into ice, and the ice becomes a filing cabinet of winter. In it is air, real air, pierced by drills as if by questions. From Vostok Station and Dome Sea and other places with names like coordinates, cylinders come up pale blue and ringing. Inside their trapped bubbles are the atmospheres our ancestors exhaled. The sky our great-grandmothers never had a chance to touch. Oxygen has isotopes. Their balance carries a memory of temperature. Dust carries the signature of deserts far away. Ash, the sudden punctuation of volcanoes. Sea salts, the hiss of open water at the edge. The cores sing a duet chemistry and time. Read long enough and you can hear the planet breathe. Carbon dioxide rises and falls. Temperature follows with the lag of a great machine. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the graph draws a soft sawtooth. Interglacials unfurling like brief flags between longer winters. The cadence is regular enough to set your watch by if your watch were made of ice and patience. We argue over the harmonics how much wobble in the Earth's path matters, how the ocean absorbs and gives back heat, how southern and northern winds swap secrets, but the melody is clear. There's nothing else like this diary anywhere on Earth. The irony is hard to miss. The most complete history we have is locked into a vault that resists us. We move with caution because we must. Drill wrong and you warm a place that has been cold since before our kind had words. In some places, the ice is a mile or two thick, pressure like a hand closing. At the base is a skin of water kept from freezing, not by sun, but by the slow heat of the planet itself and by the friction of ice sliding over rock. Lakes lie there, patient and unlit. Rivers wander, tasting stone and moving silt, as if the continent's surface were the ceiling of another world. We trace their shapes with radar as if with wishes. We lower sterile drills, anxious not to spill our century into a place no century has touched, and draw back droplets with an air of confession. In them are genetic whispers of life that learned a different book, microbes that dine on iron and sulfur in total dark and make a living that would have surprised the first natural philosophers and does not surprise an astrobiologist at all. If it can be done here, why not beneath another world's ice a curious fraternity forms around these cores and sediments and fossil leaves? Geologists and physicists and biologists begin to speak each other's dialect. A single fleck of dust in a bubble of air helps explain a shift in a faraway monsoon. A thin layer of ash can be matched to a volcano that smeared its fingerprint across the sky and cooled whole summers. What lies in Antarctica tells stories for everyone. It is the globe's memory palace, and yet it dictates the pace at which its rooms may be opened, and it dictates mood. When you hold in your hand a sliver of ice that last saw the world as sunlight and wind 400,000 winters ago, your voice drops without being asked. There are jokes in the field camps, there always are, but the sound of a core cracking clean under the weight of the drill head quiets everyone in a way that has nothing to do with rules or chiefs. The closest comparison is a library, yes, but also a chapel. You take notes, label vials, log the exact depth with the same fineness a navigator once used to mark latitude. Precision is a form of reverence. The continent also teaches a strategy. If warmth and cold trade places on time scales larger than a life, then the creatures living at the hinge either move or learn to stay. The coal seams are not just fuel. They are architecture notes from ancient trees engineering their way through long dusks. The dinosaur bones are not just trophies. They are proof that predators hunted under auroras. The pollen is not merely dust. It is a postcard from a forest that marched south until it had nowhere farther to go. And the ice is not merely an obstacle. It is the medium in which the planet wrote down what it was thinking while no one was listening. None of this makes the myths disappear. If anything, the gulf between what we can sample and what we can only image makes the speculation louder. Radar shows a flat-floored basin. Imaginations see a city. A sharp-sighted nunatak rises triangular from a field of white. It becomes a pyramid to those who prefer geometry to geology. Scientists shrug and go back to the work. But they too are tempted by romance not of lost civilizations, perhaps, but of perfect cores that reach back 1.5 million years, of a lake sealed off since before hominins stood upright, of a day when the circumpolar current flickered and the continent briefly remembered green. In laboratories lit like spaceships, the people who drill and measure are as human as the men who once marched behind dogs. They want to see, they want to know. So the narrative bends. Where once the South was a proving ground for muscle and maps, it becomes a proving ground for patience and method. The risks remain, but the heroism is different. Now the triumph is a line of dots on a graph that redraws the last 500,000 years. The tragedy is a contaminated sample. The rescue is a generator coaxed into starting at 50 below, so that a freezer stays a freezer. If the earlier expeditions taught humility before weather, these teach humility before time. And still, behind the patience and the meticulous notes, there is an ache that sounds very old. The ice is both archivist and gatekeeper. It keeps the book in order and will not let us read ahead. Men once stood at the pole and learned that victory can taste like grief. Scientists stand over a core and learn that knowledge can taste like restraint. The continent asks the same question in a new voice. Can you accept that some things reveal themselves only as slowly as they were made? Long after the dogs were gone and the air cores were tucked into silver freezers, another Antarctic story kept circling back to a piece of vellum drawn centuries earlier, inked by a mariner who never saw ice. In 1513, on a sheet of gazelle skin, later tucked away in the Topkapi Palace. The Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis sketched a world as he understood it, from the sea lanes a swath of the Atlantic, with the ragged teeth of Europe and Africa to the east, and the newly lengthened curve of South America to the west. He did not draw it alone. In the notes crowded along the coastlines, he says as much. He has stitched his chart from about 20 earlier maps, Arab and Portuguese portolans, Greek traditions, and, he believed, documents carried home by Genoese pilots who had sailed with Columbus. He speaks, too, of older sources with grand names, maps drawn in the time of Alexander, as if the ocean remembered what empires forgot. The map is a sailor's map, a web of rum lines spraying from compass roses, the Atlantic framed by painted winds, the margins populated by ships and sea creatures. It bears the compromises of its age, the bulbous bulge of South America, a foreshortened Africa, but to some eyes, the southernmost edge held a shock. There, beneath where Cape Horn wanders off the parchment, a coastline seems to bend east, then south again, scalloped as though by bays and capes, rather than the abstract sweep of myth. For those eager to connect it to the modern globe, it looked suspiciously like a glimpse of a landmass we would not reach for 3 more centuries Antarctica, and not as a fortress of ice, but with its rock bones showing. The claim arrived with a flourish in the 20th century and never really left that Piri Reis, drawn from sources older than our account of history, managed to sketch the hidden contour of the Antarctic coast with an accuracy that would not be matched until ice-penetrating radar mapped the bedrock beneath the East and West Antarctic ice sheets. The alignment, enthusiasts argued, was uncannily close, particularly along the sweep that modern geographers call Queen Maud Land. How could ink laid down in 1513 know the shape of a continent exiled under miles of frozen weight? Explanations fell into camps. The first camp preferred a tidy correction. The supposed Antarctic coast was nothing more than the lower reaches of South America, misassembled and bent eastward by a cartographer wrestling with fragments. The early 16th century was not kind to longitudes. Sailors nailed latitude with the sun and stars, but east-west positioning drifted, sometimes by whole degrees of guesswork. Stitch enough misaligned scraps together and coastlines warp like wet paper. In this telling, the mystery is a projection error dressed for the stage. The second camp did not dismiss so quickly. They took the admiral at his word that he was copying older works and wondered what older works if some original charters had mapped farther south than we credit, hugging a coastline before ice locked it in. Perhaps the outline of a temperate Antarctica slipped into the archive and down through the centuries, like a pressed leaf in different Bibles. Extend this idea and it moves from the plausible to the provocative. Perhaps the map preserved the memory of a seafaring culture lost to time, one that charted the subpolar world before the Great Freeze gripped it. The Piri Reis map became, in that light, less a chart than a rumor with ink. Between those poles, a quieter middle tried to keep its footing. Cartographers pointed out that only a third of Piri Reis's world map survives. We are reading a torn page. They note that the southern coast on the vellum is not continuous, but broken, with islands and fanciful beasts, the kind of art that creeps in when knowledge thins. They remind us how portolands behave optimized for Mediterranean trade. They prize bearings, not global geometry. Yet even these careful voices admit the seduction of coincidences, scallops that look like embayments, kinks that rhyme with real peninsulas. Human brains are tuned to find faces in smoke and patterns in noise. It is how we survived and how we get fooled. The Piri Reis chart did not stand alone. A string of 16th century maps gave the southern oceans a land to lean on. Oran's finds 1531 Mappa Mundi draped Terra Australis in scrollwork script. Rivers braided across it as if already explored. Mercator's hands later redrew a colossal southern continent to balance the north. Sometimes this land fused with South America, sometimes it stood apart. Their purpose echoed an ancient wish that the earth should be symmetrical, not verified more philosophy than hydrography. But once the eye is tuned to seek the south, the faint lines on Piri Reis's parchment seem to grow louder. The 20th century intensified the argument by giving everyone a sharper rulers. Airborne radar traced the hidden bedrock of Antarctica with a patience that 15th century sailors could not have imagined. Under ice that glows white on satellites, the continent resolves into mountain ranges, the Gamburtsevs, like a ghost, Alps and drowned lowlands, into shelves and sills and suture zones where Gondwana cracked. Enthusiasts held printouts of these new coastlines next to photographs of the vellum and traced parallels with a finger. Skeptics did the same and saw no better match than coincidence could account for. Each side accused the other of squinting. Yet a step back from the debating table, and the map's power becomes simpler. It sits at a crossroads of questions. How does knowledge travel? How does it vanish? What do we do with anomalies that refuse to sit quietly on the shelf? The Admiral's marginalia, his confession of copying, his talk of pilots and captured charts, whisper about libraries eaten by humidity, archives broken by war, ship logs moldered into illegible lace. The past is littered with lost books. It is not absurd to think that some coastal memory, perhaps carried along by Portuguese sailors who nosed farther south than prudence allowed, slipped into his compilation. But the grander claim that here is Antarctica without its ice, proof of pre-catastrophic mapping, asks us to pick between romance and restraint. We know, from ice cores and sediments, that Antarctica's deep past included warmth. We also know that for at least the last few million years, the ice has been a tyrant more often than a guest. A sudden unveiling of ice-free coasts within the span of human seafaring would require episodes we have little evidence for. The great circumpolar current does not relax its grip easily. And even if a narrow rim of rock were briefly accessible, the storms there have a way of turning ships into rumors. Still, the map resists dismissal because it is beautiful and because it promises something most of us cannot shake, that the archive of the world is not just in museums and cores, but in the accidents of survival, a skin of vellum, a line drawn slightly wrong, a note in the margin about where a pilot said he had been. You can feel the pulse of that promise in the way people handle the reproduction gently, tracing coastlines with a fingertip they would never run along a modern atlas. Perhaps the map's most unsettling gift is not a coastline, but humility. We live inside an incomplete library. What we call the known world is a provisional edition, and so the Piri Reis chart keeps its double life. In lecture halls, it is a case study in early modern cartography, how information moved between empires, how Portolan habits collided with global ambitions, how the Atlantic took shape under quill and rule. In late-night conversations and paperback theories, it is a trap door, opening onto a room where the ice is absent and ships nose along a coast we only rediscovered with machines. It is both things because Antarctica itself is both things a geography and a screen for our projections. If you listen closely, the map speaks the same refrain we have heard since Terra Australis was a necessary dream and not a measured fact. The South is where we hang our need for balance and our fear of the blank. The Admiral's ink is just another instrument playing that old tune. Whether it shows a lost shore or a stitched-together mistake, It nudges the story forward. Someone, somewhere, drew what they believed the world must be. Someone else, standing in cold heavier than iron, would later find out. Between them stretches a distance measured not only in miles and years, but in how we handle uncertainty. Perhaps that is why the Piri Reis map belongs here. In a tale of ice and secrecy, it reminds us that even when the page is fragmentary, we will try to read meaning into the torn edge. Sometimes we will be right. Sometimes we will be telling the stories to warm our hands against the cold. Either way, the vellum survives, a small, stubborn square, whispering that history, like coastline under ice, is always partly hidden and that our hunger to trace it will not end. Picture the world with the lights turned low and the continents pushed together like plates in a cupboard. In that arrangement, Antarctica is not a blank at the edge. It is the hinge of a living landscape that once linked forests, rivers, and animals across half the globe. Long before the age of silence, Antarctica belonged to a giant geologists called Gondwana, South America. Africa, India, Australia, and Madagascar braced shoulder to shoulder, their roots braided beneath a milder sky. Proof of that closeness is not rumor, it is written in a stone. The Transantarctic Mountains step across the continent for thousands of kilometers and share their bones with ranges in southern Africa and India. The Beacon supergroup sandstones answer to Karoo rocks, like cousins recognizing one another. Black seams of coal, compressed ghosts of fern forests lie under Antarctic ice, just as they do in Australia and South Africa. Dolerite dikes of the same age cut through those layers on both sides of the Indian Ocean, the fingerprints of the Ferrar magmatism that heralded the rupture to come. Fossils speak even more plainly than rock. Near the Beardmore Glacier, teams have pried from scree leaves of Glossopteris broad, tongue-shaped fronds that also appear in India, South Africa, and Australia. A single plant sprawled across lands now split by whole oceans. They are joined by the bones and burrows of Lystrosaurus, a squat, beaked survivor that waddled through river plains from today's Antarctica to the Karoo and into India, then vanished long before our species ever learned its name. For a long time, such drift sounded like heresy. Continents were thought to be fixtures, the crust a rigid shell. Then the minerals themselves gave up a secret. Tiny iron-bearing crystals in old lava cooled, pointing to the position of the poles at the moment they froze. Read in a sequence, those microscopic compasses trace wanderings too long for anything but moving plates. Add the mirror fit of continental shelves and the marching line of matching fossils and rocks, and a static Earth gives way to a planet that rearranges itself in a slow motion. The breakup arrived in stages and left signatures we still follow. Around 183 million years ago, rifts opened and basalt poured out in dark floods, the plumbing of a world under a stress. India slipped first, racing north across the Tethys and, in due time, helping to raise the Himalaya. Africa and South America parted tens of millions of years later. Their coastlines still remember the old fit like the edges of a broken amphora. Australia and Antarctica were the last pair to let go, separated by seas that widened into thoroughfares for wind and current. That highway is the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, a river the size of an ocean that wraps the planet almost without interruption. When it spun up, roughly 34 million years ago after the Tasman Gateway and Drake Passage opened, it built a cold moat around the continent. Warmth from the north found no purchase. From that moment, the climate story bent toward ice. As carbon dioxide declined and Earth's orbital geometry moved through its slow cycles, mountain glaciers merged into sheets hundreds, then thousands, of meters thick. The change did not arrive in a single winter. The planet breathes in long rhythms. There were oscillations advance and retreat, but isolation won. Forests that once tolerated months of dimness with antifreezes in their sap gave way to deserts of snow. Even the hidden landscape remembers the union. Radar, peering through the ice, sketches mountain ranges and basins as if, through pale skin, the old Gamburtsev Mountains in East Antarctica, the Lambert Rift sluicing inland, the Wilkes subglacial basin sweeping toward the coast, set Antarctica back into Gondwana, and those features make sense as continuations of belts and sutures in Africa and Australia. Mineral zones that begin in Namibia likely keep their story under Queen Maud Land. Lineaments in Western Australia have their quiet echo beneath East Antarctica. Rearranged on a modern map, they look like coincidences. Reassembled, they read like sentences across torn pages, because Gondwana was a living place and not just an arrangement of rock. Its climate matters too. Paleosols, ancient soils tell of rivers and floodplains, seasonal wet and dry, and the slow chemistry that builds and breaks fertility. Petrified forests along the trans-Antarctic mountains preserve growth rings that thicken and thin in patterns, hinting at abrupt ancient warming pulses, reminders that climate has always moved in steps as well as slopes. Pollen trapped in sediments shows floral communities migrating as coastlines shifted and mountain fronts rose. Even the dust in Antarctic ice records deserts far away, proof that a supercontinent shares its air. If the supercontinent feels distant, push the modern colors back together in your mind. Africa spooned against South America, Antarctica tucked beneath like a cupped hand, Australia swung around, India seated far south of where you expected. Now imagine animals moving along those green corridors and the spores drifting, rivers crossing what is now salt water. The distances of our world dissolve into paths. The idea that a valley in Antarctica could hold a plant also found in India stops feeling uncanny. It becomes inevitable. The implications are not only poetic. Rocks born in one furnace tend to share the same mineral endowments. Belts of iron, copper, and rare elements do not respect coastlines drawn much later. Modern surveys of the Antarctic bedrock keep Gondwana in mind, following magnetic and gravity anomalies the way a prospector follows a vein. What lies under the ice remains protected by treaty and by the ice itself. But the picture of potential sharpens year by year, not proof of hidden mines, simply the geologic logic of a world that was once whole. None of this undoes the blunt reality of what Antarctica became: isolated, armored in ice, quiet as a closed book. But the Gondwana chapter makes that quiet less alien. The continent we have set aside for science is not a stranger. It is a relative who withdrew, a piece of a family portrait that has hung in our house all along. Perhaps that is why it attracts attention that mixes a scholarship with appetite. If rocks, fossils, and ancient soils cross those old lines, might other things, memories, myths, ambitions try to cross with them? that is not licensed to plunder or proof of plots. It is a reminder of a scale. Plates will keep shifting on schedules we cannot feel. Currents will grip and release. Forests will grow and fall. The continent at the bottom of our maps has played more roles than the one we assign it today. When we call it an empty white, we are describing a moment, not a destiny. Gondwana's ghost insists on that perspective. It taps the glass of the present and points to a longer horizon, to a time when Antarctica was not a part, but a bridge. Beneath the white silence, Antarctica is not frozen solid. The weight of its own ice, the slow warmth of Earth, and the grain-by-grain friction of a continent always inching forward have carved a hidden underworld rivers that never see the sun, lakes the size of small countries, reservoirs of brine rust-red with iron, all sealed away by kilometers of ice. From far above, satellites catch the faintest clue a rise here, a slump there, as if the ice sheet were drawing breath, swelling when a subglacial lake fills and settling when that water slips downstream into another, and finally out to sea. The most famous of these secret waters is Lake Vostok, a cold inland ocean buried beneath more than 4 kilometers of East Antarctic ice. It is long, roughly the length of a major European country, and deep, with pressure so immense that the water remains liquid far below freezing. What makes Vostok a singular is time. The roof above it froze shut millions of years ago, isolating whatever lived within from the winds, dust, and microbes of the surface world. When Russian teams drilled down and drew up the first samples, they were as much ambassadors as scientists, reaching into a time capsule no human had ever touched. Getting there demanded compromises and taught hard lessons. Early boreholes were kept open with kerosene and other antifreezes, a practical choice that sparked controversy. How do you study a pristine world without staining it? Later projects adopted strict clean access methods, hot water drills using filtered, sterilized water, biosecure labs set up on the ice, protocols that looked more like a spacecraft assembly than field geology. The United States and the United Kingdom each mounted efforts at subglacial lakes in West Antarctica, perfecting a choreography of cleanliness instruments baked, tubing flushed, every sample bottle tracked like evidence in a court of law. What came up from these black waters was a small but astonishing microbial life adapted to a chemistry without sunlight. In place of photosynthesis, these organisms rely on the slow economy of rocks' metabolisms that harvest energy from iron and sulfur, that breathe with oxygen made inside the ice itself when cosmic rays split trapped water, that find nourishment in tiny trickles of organic carbon ground from the bedrock under glacial grindstones, to live in darkness, under crushing pressure, at temperatures that would freeze an ocean life, it turns out, is more patient and more inventive than we imagined. And Vostok is not alone. Radar shot from airplanes and satellites has now mapped hundreds of subglacial lakes. Some are shallow and broad, some narrow and deep. Many are connected by channels that can run for hundreds of kilometers, braiding into a concealed watershed. In West Antarctica, under fast-moving ice streams, lakes fill and drain in cycles measured in months and years. The ice above rises several meters as water wells up beneath, then sags when the cache flushes downstream, a tide with no moon to call it. These pulses matter. A sudden drainage can lubricate the bed and speed the ice above. Another stitch in the planet's complex climate fabric. At the edge of the continent, water sometimes escapes in stranger ways. Blood falls, where a subglacial brine laced with iron emerges from the tongue of Taylor Glacier and oxidizes to a theatrical red. Looks like a wound in the ice. Its chemistry supports microbes that make a living in hypersaline, oxygen-poor brines and earthly parable for life in places where nothing should live. Not far away, in the McMurdo dry valleys, bare rock and scoured soil host communities of microbes tucked into the pores of stone, hiding from the cold and feeding on trace moisture and light that sneaks through translucent quartz. The successes have not been uniform. A British attempt to reach Lake Ellsworth was abandoned when a complex drill system misbehaved in the polar night. Years later, an American-led team returned to West Antarctica and opened Mercer Subglacial Lake with clean hot water drilling. Sediments and waters came up rich with microbial DNA, the chemical fingerprints of a food web running on minerals and ancient organic matter. In some cores, scientists were startled to find tiny fragment shells, bits of algal material, even the husks of microscopic animals likely swept beneath the ice from the sea long ago, or delivered by wind before the lid sealed. Whether living hitchhikers or relics transported by ice and water, they were reminders that the boundary between surface and underworld can blur. The ice itself plays accomplice and archivist. Heat leaks from the planet's interior more strongly in some places than others. Volcanic systems slumber under the ice of West Antarctica. Mount Erebus stands openly, a rare volcano with a persistent lava lake just off the continent's edge. This uneven geothermal warmth, together with the pressure of thick ice and the friction of ice in motion, maintains water where simple cold would say there should be none. Over it all, the ice seals the record, trapping bubbles of ancient air in its layered depths and, at the bed, protecting landscapes and waterscapes that have not felt the sky in ages. All of it has changed how we imagine life elsewhere. Europa and Enceladus icy moons with oceans under crusts of ice no longer seem like speculative fables. Antarctica provides a working model of darkness sustained by chemistry alone, of ecosystems sealed from sunlight, yet animated by gradients of energy as subtle as a difference in oxidation state between two neighboring minerals. Engineers designing probes to melt through alien ice now practice in Antarctica, learning how to keep instruments sterile, how to navigate without sight, how to collect a sample without erasing the thing they came to find. To say that such discoveries inspire wonder is obvious. They also invite a speculation. If lakes can harbor life for millions of years, if rivers wander beneath the continent unseen, then what else might endure down there? Most scientists answer plainly microbes, perhaps thin layers of biofilm, maybe where brine meets rock colonies thicker than a thumbnail. The deeper leap into visions of fish or forests preserved in the cold belongs to storytelling. Still, strange radar reflections and neat geometric shadows in satellite imagery, usually ice folded by wind and time, or artifacts of how data are processed, feed the human habit of pattern making. Under a regime of necessary caution and limited access, suspicion grows like hoarfrost. Caution is not only bureaucratic, it is moral and scientific. A borehole is a two-way door. A careless instrument can seed an ancient lake with surface bacteria that outcompete natives honed by eons. A sloppy pump can draw modern snowmelt down into a fossil environment and erase a record we did not yet know how to read. That is why clean access looks so severe. Why teams spend days sterilizing tubing and years planning a single hour of sampling. In a world where we have touched and altered nearly everything, Antarctica's buried waters demand a different posture, not conquest, but ceremony. And yet even ceremony arouses doubt. Clean rooms on ice resemble secrecy. Restricted zones designed to protect wildlife and fragile landforms look to outsiders like velvet ropes guarding something unnamed. The gap between care and control is narrow, and into it fall rumors of structures sensed by radar, of signals cut from public maps, of corridors where aircraft may not fly. Perhaps that is inevitable in a place as removed as this, where even sunlight arrives tilted and rare, where most of us will never walk and all we have are second-hand pictures and the words of those who returned. Return to Lake Vostok in your mind and consider the patience of the thing, a body of water resting under ice so clear that ancient stars are still recorded in trapped bubbles, a population of microbes metabolizing at the pace of stone weathering, currents so slow they measure in seasons and decades rather than hours. In a century defined by speed, Antarctica's underworld is a lesson in the opposite. The ice will allow us to read a few sentences per generation. If we hurry or grow careless, the book closes. So we watch the surface rise and fall. We listen for the whisper of subglacial floods in the tremors of the ice. We tune radar and refine hot water drills and make our notes in the margin. It is not an empty study. Hidden lakes shape the march of glaciers to the sea. Their pulses can hasten or slow the ice that locks away meters of potential sea level rise. Even if we cared nothing for the beauty of a sealed ecosystem, we would care for its influence. Antarctica's underworld is not just a curiosity, it is a hinge on which the future of coasts may quietly turn. In the meantime, the mythic Antarctica and the measured one overlap at the edges of the map. The imagination paints cities of ice and vault of knowledge, gateways to inner worlds. The instruments return conductivity, temperature, salinity, strands of DNA. Between them stands the ice, a faithful archivist, an imperfect veil. We do not have to choose between awe and accuracy. In this place, the two are the same thing, humility, before a world that has kept its own counsel for a very long time, in a century that can photograph the face of Mars and thread satellites through the slipstreams of Jupiter. You might think Earth had surrendered every secret it had to give. Yet Antarctica teaches the opposite lesson. The more cameras we turn upon it, the more its silence multiplies. Among millions of images, the bleached jigsaw of ice, the faint spiderwebs of crevasse fields, one picture in particular, was enough to set imaginations alight, a perfect-looking triangle rising from white emptiness, its planes crisp as a ruler's edge. The internet named it at once the Antarctic Pyramid. From that single frame, 1,000 stories bloomed of ancient architects, of buried cities, of a geometry too precise for mere weather and time. Seen more closely, the pyramid is a nunatak, a mountain peak poking above the ice sheet like the crown of a drowned cathedral. Antarctica has many of them, especially where mountain ranges shoulder through the ice. Ellsworth, Sentinel, Heritage, Prince Charles. Glaciers gnaw at their flanks from 3 or more sides, carving steep faces and leaving an angular horn at the summit. Snow scours off the windward plains and drifts on the leeward ones. Freeze and thaw, yes. Even here, shatter rock along joints. Gravity cleans the debris. Where 3 arêtes converge, the silhouette can look eerily architectural, like the Matterhorn's alpine kin. From space, light and shadow harden that illusion into straight lines. Human perception is a pattern-hungry animal. We read faces in the moon and saints in the mustains of stone. A satellite's eye only encourages the habit. Pixel grids impose their own geometry. Mosaics stitch images from different days and angles into one seamless map. Compression leaves halos and edges where none exist. A sun low on the horizon drapes ridges with deep shade that exaggerates every edge. The result is a gallery of tempting shapes, rectangles on sastrugi fields, dark openings where the lip of a crevasse throws a shadow, tidy triangles where wind-polished blue ice meets drifting snow. So the pyramid was not alone. Other frames appeared long dark streaks that looked like tunnels bored into the ice, perfect ovals like hanger mouths, vast squares that seemed too neat to be natural. Many were the work of wind, sculpting snow into ridges and troughs called sastrugi that march for kilometers in locked step. Some were moulins, vertical shafts where summer melt plunges into the glacier, ringed by shadow until the camera's angle makes them seem like doorways. Some were simple processing seams a satellite passed on a cloudy afternoon, left a gap. Another pass filled it weeks later with slightly different snow, and the border hardened into an impossible straight line. There are genuine oddities, of course. The dry valleys are a landscape from another planet, where hyper-cold air drinks moisture from the sky and the ground wears stones instead of snow. Their shadows cut crisp and long across the valley floor. Blood Falls, where a brine rich in iron spills from Taylor Glacier, stains ice the color of rust and photographs like a wound. Volcanic cones in the South Sandwich Arc rise from the sea and acquire snowy symmetry a pharaoh might admire. None require buried builders. All remind us how easily the eye can mistake drama for design. But a skepticism alone rarely ends a story. It often sharpens it, because Antarctica is hard to reach and harder to traverse. Almost no one with a question can simply walk to a curious coordinate and see for themselves. Access is rationed by weather, by money, by logistics, by the practical need to keep aircraft out of the teeth of katabatic winds and away from fragile wildlife colonies. The distance between a viral image and a field survey might be measured not in kilometers, but in years. In that gap, interpretation expands like breath in cold air. The data pipeline adds another layer of haze. Raw satellite frames are corrected for the curve of the Earth and the tilt of the sensor, draped over digital elevation models, color balanced, and joined to their neighbors. A bright return from a slab of blue ice where wind has planed away snow to expose hard, old ice can saturate a detector and leave a bloom that looks like glow. Snow dunes migrate. A dune crest caught in one pass and vanished in the next becomes a ghost shadow that repeats along a seam. The language of cameras and algorithms is precise, but not always intuitive. and when translated into the language of wonder, it becomes a story. Story, to be clear, is not the opposite of truth. It is the vessel we use to carry truth across distances we cannot otherwise cross. The caution is simply this. In Antarctica, the distances are very great. A nunatak sharpened by 3 glaciers is still a mountain, not a monument. A moulin is a drain in a river of ice, not a gate. And yet, the persistence of such images tells us something important about ourselves. We want the blank places on the map to be more than cold. We want them to have meaning proportionate to their mystery. There is another irony. Sometimes the real geometries under the ice are stranger than the imagined ones. Radar reveals subglacial lakes bounded by flat, dead-level surfaces water in perfect equilibrium beneath a ceiling of ice. Basalt channels etched by pressurized flows can run ruler straight for kilometers. Crevasse fields unfold in fan-like arrays with such regularity that they look, in plan view, like engineered trusses. Nature's toolkit, given time and pressure, is entirely capable of making patterns that punish our idea of what randomness looks like. Why, then, do these pictures grip us so partly because Antarctica is already the stage for so many real thresholds? There are caves in ice where ancient air is trapped, under ice estuaries where sea and glacier braid together, and dry valleys where life survives in the pores of warm stone. If we can accept microbes thriving in a brine that never sees the sun, what else might we accept? The imagination, once invited into the room, will not sit quietly in a corner. It wanders from Vostok's dark waters to triangles in the snow and asks whether one might be a signpost to the other. None of this means the continent is closed to astonishment, only that astonishment has good company in patience. Geologists carry compasses and clinometers to those sharp nunatak ridges and measure the strike and dip of beds that tell of Gondwana's slow unbraiding. Glaciologists map wind fields to understand why a dune appears here and not there. Pilots thread routes between mountain weather and the long shadows of winter and bring home images taken at angles that strip illusion from shape. Piece by piece, the picture steadies. And yet, we should admit the pleasure of the question. In the hush of a winter evening, when the sky over the polar plateau turns from steel to violet and the sun draws a blue blade along the edge of every ridge, even the most practical scientist may pause. The triangle on the horizon is a mountain that is known, but the thought that it could be a signal from some other age, some other intelligence, is a thought as old as maps. Antarctica, with its habit of making the familiar look otherworldly, protects that thought without needing to endorse it. If the pyramid is a nunatak and the doorway a crevasse's shadow, the images still serve a purpose. They lure us back to the white continent and make us ask for the slower, truer story: how mountains resist and yield, how wind writes and erases, how cameras can mislead, and how to read them better. They remind us that in an age of instant certainty, there is still value in the unanswered, and they prepare us, perversely, for the next step in the tale, when myths cease to be mere shapes and gather into full architectures, entire worlds imagined beneath the ice, with names borrowed from sacred geographies, and the diaries real and rumored of men who flew beyond the last line on the map. If the pyramid was a trick of light and geology, The next step in the human mind is to stop looking at single shapes and imagine an entire architecture under the ice. For centuries, a certain fever dream has circled the poles that our planet might be hollow, latticed with caverns vast as countries, entered through gates at the ends of the earth. The idea flickered first in early modern Europe when philosophers tried to explain compass quirks and auroras with models of nested shells. Later, a frontier showman declared there were open holes at both poles and petitioned governments to let him lead a caravan inside. The specifics changed with each generation, but the door always remained in the same place out on the blank white, where weather erased footsteps and the horizon made promises it never had to keep. Over time, that Western machine dream of cavities and shells fused with older, stranger geographies preserved in story-hidden realms beneath mountains, cities lit by an inner sun, sanctuaries where knowledge was kept while the surface world forgot. A name took hold Agartha, and with it, a soft tangle of associations, some borrowed from the steppe and the Himalaya, some invented whole cloth by mystics convinced that wisdom would be safer if hidden under rock. To them, the poles were not just coordinates, but veils, and if one veil had to be chosen in the modern age, Antarctica felt inevitable. It had everything a myth needs: distance, danger, silence, and a beauty so stark it bent reason toward reverence. Into that silence walked an American admiral whose life already read like a parable of edges and horizons. Richard Evelyn Byrd flew over the Arctic when navigation over blank ice was guesswork and grit, and he crossed the Antarctic skies when engines still coughed in cold and compasses sulked. Around him, America learned to think of the poles as theaters of courage, and Byrd, aviator, organizer, builder of bases on nothing, became their poet. After the war, he returned south at the head of a task force so large it seemed absurd for a land that could not be conquered. When he spoke about what he'd learned, the press was listening. It was in that listening that something curious happened. A handful of foreign newspapers reported that Byrd, reflecting on the new frontiers, warned of threats that could move from pole to pole at incredible speed. In the glow around those words, stories multiplied. Some said he had glimpsed a warm land beyond the ice itself. Others produced a lost diary in which Byrd supposedly described being drawn through an opening into an inner world, full of green light, unknown beasts, and a civilization that spoke to him as if they had been waiting for his arrival. The tone was hushed, the grammar quaint, the punctuation too careful, as if, even then, the author knew it would be read in a listening posture, eyes widened in the blue light of late night. Historians shook their heads. The events described in the diary could not be squared with flight logs, weather records, fuel limits, the simple arithmetic of time and distance. No original manuscript surfaced, only reprints and retellings. The warning about fast pole-hopping craft could be read as a metaphor for a world in which jets and rockets had just entered the vocabulary, where a bomber might soon cross the planet over ice instead of ocean, and the lush valley beyond the ice Antarctica has them, of a sort, though they do not need caves to exist. There are dry valleys where the air is so cold and starved of moisture that ice refuses to form, exposing brown stone and gravel slopes like the bones of a planet. On volcanic islands, Steam vents carve blue rooms inside drifts and mantles of snow. Mosses and microbes cling to their warmed walls like monks in winter cloisters. If a man flown over the right place at the right hour saw mist rising from black rock, sun refracted in a halo around a plume, a river winding through a field the wind had scoured bare, what would he call it? On a page he had waited a lifetime to write, even without borrowed exotica, the polar atmosphere plays tricks that any storyteller would envy. Light bends unpredictably where temperature layers stack like glass panes. A distant ridge appears to float. An open lead of water looks like polished basalt. The far sea climbs into the sky and drapes itself there as a false shore. The old name for such mirages, Fata Morgana, belongs as much to fairy tale as to physics, along with halos and sundogs, with nacreous clouds that gleam like oil spilled across a dawn sky, with pillars of light thrown up by ice crystals in the air. These optics make a theater of apparition out of an otherwise simple horizon. You could spend a year on the plateau and still find, on one blue noon, that a seam has opened in the sky and that you can't quite make sense of what is on the other side. It is easy to see how such phenomena became mortar for the walls of an inner world. The notion of Agartha gives the yearnings a name, and birds' celebrity gives them a herald, even if the herald did not say what he is supposed to have said. Meanwhile, the terrain itself contributes props that make the myth feel practical. Tunnels. The Ai has them moulins, some wide enough to swallow a house, where meltwater plunges toward the bed. Caverns. The volcano at the edge of the Ross Ice Shelf breathes into the snow and leaves behind aisles and domes of crystal, some lit pale green by the living films that coat them. Warmth. Under kilometers of ice, pressure, and the Earth's heat keep lakes liquid for hundreds of thousands of years. One might argue forever that these are not entrances, but cul-de-sacs, that to descend into them is to move deeper into the known. The human mind will still file them, stubbornly, under doors. What gives the Antarctic version of the Hollow Earth story such stamina is not only the landscape's cooperation, but also the way the continent sits at the crossing of three powerful narratives. First is our hunger for refuge, tales, places where wisdom and goodness went into hiding when the world turned noisy. Second is the modern lesson that astonishing things do exist in black ice and dark water, that lakes can be sealed away for geologic spans and yet host life, that rocks remember forests where now there's only night. And third is the cold fact of control. This is a land with rules about who may go, where, and why, a land where even legitimate science must be scheduled and justified, a land where the uninvited very often die. A rumor thrives in any locked room. Antarctica is locked by distance, cost, and the kind of weather that ends questions along with expeditions. Skepticism, to be responsible, should not laugh. It should do what it has always done best: compare claims with maps and fuel ranges. Ask why a text appears only when it is useful to a particular kind of hope, and put apparent wonders next to a catalog of natural ones to see which answer strains less. When it does that here, the picture steadies. The secret diary looks like a pastiche built from earlier polar romances and post-war anxieties. The warm realm beyond the pole resembles either a mirage or the dry valleys, whose starkness is, in its way, stranger than any inner sun. The voice of the wise underground city echoes the voices of those 19th century writers who wanted their own books to feel like prophecy. And yet, even after the pages have been weighed and found wanting, the impulse that animated them remains. We ache for a door in the ice because something in us still believes that the deep answers live at the edge of the known. Antarctica does not need fiction to be a threshold. It is one already. A pilot hunting weather breaks finds himself staring down into a world lit from below by the sea, where pressure cracks glow like threads in blue glass. A geologist standing on a nunatak lays her hand on a rock whose twin was last touched in India. And in that touch, two continents braid back together for a heartbeat. A biologist lowers a sampler into a lake that has not met the air since before human speech began and lifts out organisms that have made a peace with darkness we can barely imagine. In such moments, the continent proves that the border between myth and measurement is thin only because we insist on drawing it in ink. Still, stories make their own weather. The Hollow Earth tale and its Antarctic gate will not vanish under the weight of any paper. It satisfies too many longings at once for shelter from the noisy present, for hidden wisdom, for a surprise that makes our maps look provisional again. And there is one more reason it persists. The next chapter of Antarctica's 20th century summons a different cast of seekers, ideologues hunting omens, engineers hunting prestige, and sends them south with instruments and flags. They come not to ask the ice if it remembers, but to see if it can be made to serve. Their ships bear symbols that require myth to feel like destiny. And the blank of Queen Maud Land suddenly fills with names borrowed from German hills. When their story drifts back north, shorn of documents and choked with rumors, the old dream of entrances and sanctuaries simply wraps itself around their intentions and hardens. The result is a new legend with new uniforms, moving across the same old stage of wind and white. The rumor needs uniforms, and in 1938 they arrive stitched in gray. As Europe tightens like a drum, Nazi Germany sends a ship south under a name borrowed from home Schwabenland. It is no icebreaker, but a catapult ship refitted to fling flying boats into the pale air. On board are sailors, surveyors, and aviators under Captain Alfred Richer, an Arctic veteran with a surveyor's patience. Officially, the mission is practical to the point of banality: whale oil. Germany's factories and kitchens run on it. The government wants to loosen Norway's grip on the trade, find new grounds, find leverage, bring back maps. The maps they bring back are crisp and strange, launched by steam catapult. The Dornier flying boats lift from the gray sea and skim above the white. Cameras stitching long seams across a continent that had, until then, mostly resisted being seen from the air. They drop metal markers, slender spears, with flags onto nunataks and ridgelines, as if punctuating a sentence no one else can read. In a few months, they photograph an area the size of a country and lace it with German names: the Mühlich-Hoffmann Mountains, the Schirmacher Oasis, a ribbon of ice-free lakes and dark rock that seems, in photographs, like a misprint. Richer's crew nails rehearsal flags into the wind and calls the region Neuschwabenland New Swabia, laid over Queen Maud Land as if paper could outvote the past. On paper, at least, the expedition is a success. The photographs will matter. The names will stick in atlases for decades, but paper has margins, and it is in those margins that other stories take root. The Third Reich had already cultivated a taste for myth and the machinery of belief Thule, Atlantis, secret lineages, and histories pressed into the service of a future that required magic to feel inevitable. The Ahnenerbe sends men into mountains and archives in search of proofs. A state imagines it can dig up destiny like a lost coin. When ships fly south under such a banner, even a survey can be made to look like a pilgrimage. After the war, the vacuum where documents should be begins to hum. What exactly did Germany do with its moment on the ice? Where are the detailed logs? Why did the expedition's photogrammetric haul, so valuable to any cartographer, become so hard to see in that silence? The continent's easy metaphors emptiness as secrecy, distances as veils harden into a different kind of certainty. A rumor acquires a number, base 211. It acquires a function, a refuge, a vault, an underground factory where the war would not end on schedule. It acquires machines' disks with names that sound like weather and thunder. It acquires migration routes, U-boats with vanishing cargo, slipping past blockades and surrendering months late in Argentine ports. Their captains vague in interrogation rooms about where they have been. Each scrap, ambiguous alone, braids into a rope sturdy enough to drag an audience across decades. The facts resist. The Schwabenland is not a warship. Its catapult is meant for mail and reconnaissance, not conquest. There is no credible record of a permanent German base built in the few summer weeks of 1938 or 39. No tonnage of cement and steel moving through ice-choked seas to anchor bunkers in bedrock. The Schirmacher lakes, which look like invitations, are hard to use. Their open water is a trick of geology and wind, not warmth. Yet even these corrections only make the larger story more durable. A secret lies best where truth is technical, where a sentence beginning with in fact must detour through the physics of catapults and the logistics of polar construction. The larger context makes the tale feel inevitable. The Reich's taste for emblem and ritual was never merely decorative, it was a technology of conviction. It repurposed old myths and installed them like gears in a new clock. If there was anywhere on Earth that could echo its hunger for grand, pure spaces the stage on which to perform a future, it was the one place where no one lived, where a flag would not merely be planted, but seem to invent the wind it flapped in. Photographs of white deserts and black peaks, men in goggles and greatcoats, a ship dwarfed by ice, these are propaganda's favorite colors. Then there are the after images. Some German U-boats really do appear in the South Atlantic long after the war has been called. U-530 and U-967 surrender in Argentina in 1945. Their logs produce instrumentally dull explanations about zigzags and delays, about evasion and indecision, about crews in the habit of not writing every hour of fear down in a book. To a mind already tuned to secret chord progressions, those explanations sound like the right kind of silence. The rumor copies itself. The boats offloaded something before they surrendered. The something was personnel. The personnel had a destination beyond the charts. The destination had been prepared during that quiet summer 7 years earlier. The edges of mysticism and engineering blur in the warm breath of the story. It is said that in New Swabia, beneath the ice, the Reich tested forms of flight that sounded like fiction then and advertising now: disc craft, vertical lifts, engines that hummed instead of roared. It is said that on the blank white they sought vril, a metaphysical energy borrowed from a Victorian novel and repackaged as science, a convenient word for power that could be conjured from air by those who said the right words in the right hall. It is said that somewhere under the plateau, a cavern roof has been braced with concrete, and that somewhere in that cavern a light is on. The only thing certain in these sentences is their grammar passive voice, indefinite source, a future implied if one only believes hard enough that pasts can be rearranged. What the documents will give you is smaller but no less revealing. The expedition did fly thousands of kilometers and mapped roughly 600,000 square kilometers of coast and mountain. It did take oblique photographs whose geometry later helped build a three-dimensional sense of glaciers and rock. It did discover oases where dark stones lay bare in the sun. It did drape a German name over a Norwegian one and come home to headlines. It did leave Europe with the sense that Antarctica had joined a stage where great powers perform. If you were looking for the seed of a later military interest, American, Soviet, and then American again, you would find it here, in the way a survey can be read as a prelude, because the question that floats in the air after 1945 is simple: if the Nazis had gone south to see the refuge, how would the victors respond? In August of 1946, less than a year after the last shots in the Pacific, a task force sails south so large that even the word expedition feels small in its mouth. It is billed as practice, as science, as a logistical ballet on an icy stage. It is led by a man whose name, to rumor, already glows. Ships fan into the Southern Ocean, aircraft sweep the coast. Cameras, once again, stitch white to black. The operation will end early, officially for reasons of whether and where. But the gift of timing is too generous for any skeptic to keep. A legend is already unpacking its bags, ready to live in whatever empty buildings of explanation the press does not fill. In that sense, New Swabia is less an isolated chapter than a hinge. On one side, a state that craved sacred geographies to sanctify its politics, and a survey mission that let it sketch a sacred border where there had been only wind. On the other, a post-war world in which Antarctica becomes a proxy theater, where fleets and flags and film crews justify themselves as science while carrying other, quieter curiosities in their holds. Between them, a rumor that hardens with every retelling, because it satisfies two appetites at once: the appetite for a hidden adversary who has not yet surrendered, and the appetite for a place on Earth where the maps can be wrong in exactly the way we wish them to be. To walk the corridor between record and a story is to feel both temperatures at once. In one hand, there is the chill fact of a fast, focused survey shaped by whaling economics and propaganda needs. In the other, the warm pulse of a myth that has learned to breathe on its own, borrowing oxygen from every blank page and every missing log. The truth is that Antarctica did not need a base to become the stage for a new kind of conflict. It only needed to be what it already was: remote, austere, expensive to reach, slow to forgive mistakes, and is stunning on film. The rest, the concrete, the caverns, the engines that hum, is the human desire to give the ice a voice that says what we want to hear. And yet, when the American Armada appears on the horizon with Admiral Byrd again on its bridge. The old questions grow new legs. If New Swabia was only flags and photographs, why answer it with carriers and destroyers? If the war was over, why bring so many guns to a place without enemies? If the purpose is practice, why not practice where there are ports and spare parts? The eyes does not answer. It never does. It only reflects, sending back whatever we shine at it, our fears, our ambitions, our longing for a door, and then waits for the next footstep to squeak on its surface and write another line. The year after the war ends, a fleet points its bows toward the bottom of the map. In August 1946, the United States sends Task Force 68 Operation Highjump south. Admiral Richard E. Byrd serves as the expedition's public face. Rear Admiral Richard H. Cruzen commands the ships. The manifest reads like a minor invasion, about 4,700 men, 13 ships, 33 aircraft. For a land of ice and silence, this is a thunderous arrival. Why send a task force to the end of the world? Officially train men and machines for polar work. Test equipment in cold that breaks seals and wills. Establish a foothold on the Ross Ice Shelf. Photograph and map the last blanks. Practice logistics on an inhuman stage. Unofficially, planners read a colder brief. The globe is shrinking. Transpolar flights will matter. Whether born in the south, will climb into the temperate world, and in a new rivalry with Moscow, reach itself has become a weapon. From the outset, High Jump looks like a film with too many reels. Deck crews fling planes into a light so clean it seems unbreathed. Seaplanes lift from iron water and a step back down like ungainly birds. Bulldozers bite the shelf to make room for Little America, a temporary town of canvas and plywood, braced against winds that have crossed a continent. Camera teams work with taped cheeks and stiff fingers. Their footage will later be cut into a feature documentary, proof that the Navy did not go south merely to practice drills, but to show an audience at home what the end of the world looks like. The hazards are immediate. Metal grows brittle. Lubricants thicken. A gloved hand lingers too long and cloth fuses to steel. The weather owns the right of way, 1 hour a bowl of blue. The next, a white wall that erases the horizon so completely that men rope themselves together to walk between tents. There's triumph flights over territory no one has seen from the air. Triangulated photo runs that bite depth out of flatness. A base stamped into the snow where there was none. And there is grief. A Navy seaplane crashes in a blinding storm. 3 airmen never come home. The line between daring and risk proves as thin as ice in a spring. Officially, the plan calls for 6 to 8 months of work. Unofficially, High Jump compresses itself. Within weeks of the austral summer's peak, groups begin to fold back, ground blizzards chew supply lines, ice traps tenders in bays like beetles pinned to a card, equipment sledges, tractors, radios proves allergic to a cold that climbs inside housings and rewrites tolerances. Air is a machinery of knives. By February 1947, much of the task force is turning north, its greatest lessons boxed with film and charts and bundled logs. It is exactly here, in the seam between plan and retreat, that legend climbs in. Why, ask columnists in far ports. Bring a carrier and destroyers to practice meteorology. Why leave early if endurance was the lesson? Why does an operation build as training field? In the photographs, like reconnaissance. In South American newspapers, an interview appears in which Byrd is quoted warning that the United States should prepare for the possibility of attack by flying objects able to move from pole to pole at incredible speeds. The quote will be repeated, embellished, doubted, revived, exactly the sort of sentence that lets a rumor hibernate and then wake again when the weather of opinion changes. Conspiracy blossoms the way lichens do on the rare warm stones of the Antarctic oases, slowly at first, then with indifference to cold. One story says Highjump went south to root out a surviving Nazi presence in Queen Maud Land, a base 211 carved into caverns beneath the ice during the strangest years of the war. Another insists as scouts with cameras became witnesses to a technology older than memory, aerodynamic ideas parked in the snow until someone came back for them. A third braids these with whispers of craft that climbed and turned with impossible grace, and a fleet that came home sooner than planned because it had seen enough. The official narrative remains steady. Highjump achieved its primary goals. It proved that men and steel could be moved, housed, and supplied on the ice at a scale. It refined cold weather doctrine for pilots, deck crews, and construction battalions. It shot miles of film and thousands of photographs that sharpened maps and fed geologic curiosity. It exposed which gaskets split, which fuels gelled, which procedures failed, lessons that would have cost more lives if postponed. In this telling, the early drawdown reflects prudence, not panic. The continent punished haste and rewarded planning, and the Navy adjusted, and yet the other telling refuses to thaw. The abundance of imagery becomes suspect when set against the few minutes the public ever sees. The celebrated documentary shows penguins, tractors, laughter crusted with frost, a horizon that never changes. Skeptics ask what reels were left on the cutting room floor. The crash becomes, in some retellings, something other than weather. Once an audience has been trained by a decade of war to expect an enemy, it will invent one if none appears. Byrd himself becomes a screen onto which hopes and fears are projected. To some, he is the witness who hints at dangers beyond the map. To others, he is simply a consummate showman with an explorer's gift for drama. Outside the theater of rumor, the practical consequences are clear. Highjump is a dress rehearsal for the logistics that will, a decade later, place permanent stations across the continent. It trains cadres who will form the spine of Operation Deep Freeze in the 1950s and support the International Geophysical Year. It seeds a public expectation that Antarctica is not a blank but a frontier where nations can demonstrate excellence without firing a shot. It also sends a quieter message to rivals: we can go anywhere, and we can sustain ourselves when we get there. Highjump also inaugurates a new genre of Antarctic story, the state expedition, wrapped simultaneously in science and strategy. From this point forward, the continent will be spoken of in two voices at once: the warm cadence of climate and geology, and the clipped diction of operations orders. Every runway on the ice will be both a launchpad for weather balloons and a symbol of reach. Every camera will be both a research instrument and a scout's eye. Every silence in a report will be read two ways: as caution and as omission. Byrd returns from the south standing at the hinge between those voices. He is both the public gentleman explorer and the officer whose logbooks carry classifications on their covers. Both the parent of Little Americas and the man quoted rightly or wrongly as warning of machines that move like ideas. His charisma lets audiences have it both ways, the dignity of science and the thrill of a secret war inhabiting a single frost-burned figure. If you want a single image to hold from Highjump, choose this: a line of men on the Ross ice shelf, backs hunched against a wind that has learned their names, guide in a tractor whose exhaust flashes for one breath before the cold eats it. Behind them, a camera on a tripod. In front, a horizon that has not yet agreed to be measured. Off to the side, invisible to the lens, but unmistakably present, sit two versions of the future one, in which these routines become the rituals of a continent at peace, and one in which the same routines become a staging for contests we prefer not to name. Between those futures, Highjump leaves a wake. It is full of data and broken bolts and the memory of 3 airmen whose families received folded flags. It is also full of sentences that begin, "What if?" That is Antarctica's specialty. It sends ships home carrying both facts and appetite. The facts are enough to fill libraries. Appetite, however, writes faster. When the ships of Operation Highjump steamed home and the reels of film were boxed for cutting, a different cargo slipped into the world words. In early 1947, South American newspapers ran an interview with Admiral Richard E. Byrd, in which he was quoted as warning that the United States must be prepared for attack by flying objects able to travel from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Other columns added a further flourish beyond the southern pole. He had supposedly hinted, lay a vast, lush land. The phrasing changed as it crossed borders, as with all good rumors. Each retelling gave it more breadth. Scholars would later point out how difficult it is to verify those quotations, how second-hand translations and sensational headlines can turn a cautionary generality into an omen. Yet the sentence stuck. It did so because it balanced on a fulcrum of plausibility. If anyone could speak about the poles like that, it was Byrd, the man who had flown over the North Pole, acclaim some contest, the man who, in 1929, circled the South Pole in a Ford Tri-Motor, the man whose name was stamped on the Little Americas like postmarks at the bottom of the world. Then came a document that would never quite die, the so-called secret diary. In its pages, circulated decades later, never authenticated, dismissed by historians and the Navy alike. Byrd supposedly recounts a flight into a warm green valley, describes craft of impossible maneuver, even claims his plane was taken under control and guided to a realm within. The details read like the script of a dream: a land without ice, a light that was not our sun, beings more advanced than men, courteous and grave. It is an elegant fake, if fake it is, crafted to be irresistible to anyone already half convinced that the planet keeps a second face. Why did the diary lodge so easily in the imagination? Because, like the rumored interview, it rhymes faintly with things that are true. On the map of Antarctica are places that do not fit the shorthand endless white. Pilots on Highjump really did report an oasis, a tract of bare rock and ice-free lakes later known as the Bunger Hills. Dark water scalloped by winds, shorelines glazed with mineral films that gleamed brown and blue beneath the sun. Along the coast and in the interior, other pockets, oases, and dry valleys break through the ice: the Schermacher Oasis, the McMurdo Dry Valleys, where katabatic winds scour snow away to reveal a stony desert. Taylor Glacier's Blood Falls, an iron-rich brine that bleeds rust into the air. Don Juan Pond, so saline it refuses to freeze. In summer, you can see moss the color of old felt, lichen like minute green fires, tiny invertebrates waking in meltwater. Green valleys exist, but on a human scale fragile, improbable. Nothing like the temperate refuge of legend, and all the more haunting because they are real. There are tricks of light as well. The polar atmosphere manufactures illusions with a theater's instinct for timing. Fata Morgana mirages stack and invert horizons into islands that never were. Parhelia sun dogs hang bright false suns at either side of the real one. Polar stratospheric clouds bloom with nacreous color. Mother of pearl that looks more painted than physical. A man already inclined to see the world as marvelous might remark upon these spectacles and find his remarks fermented by editors into something more prophetic than intended. And then there is Bird the person, who did not need invention to seem larger than life. In 1934, he wintered alone at a station called Advance Base. 70-odd miles from his main camp, he nearly died there, poisoned by carbon monoxide seeping from a poorly vented stove, slowly undone in a landscape where rescue was as risky as death. He wrote of it later with a quiet candor in a book simply called Alone, describing a night sky like a great church window and the way solitude had carved new shapes in his mind. When a man like that speaks even obliquely of wonders, people listen past his caution for the hint of revelation. There's also the Cold War context that makes the flying objects sentence, whether authentic or embroidered, feel less like fantasy and more like a metaphor. In 1947, aircraft were already outrunning old geographies. Experimental jets were pushing the sound barrier. Rocket programs ransacked from the ruins of Europe were rewriting notions of reach. From pole to pole could be the breathless shorthand of a newspaperman for a truth the military already understood. Future threats would shrug at oceans. In that reading, Bird's warning is simply professional sobriety, collapsed by print into a line that will serve any theory you like. Still, the diary and the interview endure because Antarctica rewards the appetite for thresholds. The continent is made of edges of shelf and sea, of light and months of night, and edges are where storytellers like to place doors. The inner earth needs an entrance. The legend hands you one a notch in the ice where a valley is warm, where the horizon ripples with mirage, where a pilot returns shaken and says, softly or not at all, that the map does not show everything. Denials sensible, documented arrive, and they are filed properly. But the story finds another host and goes on living. If you reduce the myth to its bone, this is what remains observers saw and sometimes filmed. Ice-free ground, they walked in air warmed by a sun that never quite sets. They watched colors in the sky that do not appear at lower latitudes. They flew over terrain for which there were no names. These are experiences enough to stretch language, put them through the mill of distance, translation, and the human fondness for embroidery. And you have a narrative that will outlast the names of ships. There's also the open secret of oases that behave like laboratories for other worlds. In the dry valleys, the Onyx River runs backward from the sea, a seasonal thread of meltwater that evaporates into the sky. Under the ice of certain lakes, life persists without sunlight, cradled by chemistry alone. Volcanic heat seeps from Mount Erebus, and in the lee of rocks warmed by months of summer sun, microclimates occur that would feel like miracles to a pilot glancing down from 10,000 feet. The ideas of green and warm are relative words. In a place where your breath crystallizes, 5 degrees above freezing can feel like a theft from Eden. None of this requires hollow worlds or craft beyond physics to be wondrous. But it does explain the stubbornness of the alternative. When official reports feel spare, the mind supplies connective tissue. When logs are redacted or summarized, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bureaucratic ones, imagination pours into the negative space and hardens there. The secret diary becomes a parable about the difference between what is seen and what is said. The disputed interview becomes a mirror angled just so, catching the reflection of fears about technologies that arrive faster than language can name them. Perhaps the kindest way to read these stories is to see them as invitations rather than verdicts. They ask us to hold 2 truths at once: that Antarctica contains phenomena so strange that they can look like fiction, and that fiction often grows where information thins. They also place Byrd in his rightful frame, not as a prophet of hidden realms, nor as a mere emblem stamped on envelopes and bases, but as a complicated witness to a continent that makes complicated witnesses of everyone who lingers there. From this chapter, the road bends toward policy. When rumors and realities collide, nations reach for agreements that promise to lower the temperature. The next act will usher in signatures and seals, a treaty that claims to still the noise of rivalry by invoking science and peace. But even that document will carry, in its careful clauses, the same ambiguity that trails Byrd's most famous sentences. In Antarctica, even our attempts at clarity acquire a halo. The Cold War loved lines iron curtains, latitudes, perimeters, and yet in 1959 the world's rivals sat in a wood-paneled room in Washington and signed away a whole one everything south of 60-degree latitude. 12 nations put their names to the Antarctic Treaty on December 1st. Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union, and in doing so, they tried something humanity rarely attempts to declare a place off limits to conquest. The document would enter into force in 1961, but its spirit had been rehearsed already during the International Geophysical Year. When scientists traded data across political trenches, and a small fleet of ice-strengthened ships learned the stubborn geography of the Southern Ocean. Out of that season of cooperation came a pact written in the patient grammar of law: Antarctica shall be used for peaceful purposes only. Nuclear explosions and the disposal of radioactive waste are forbidden. Scientific investigation shall be free, and observations and results exchanged. All territorial claims are frozen in place, no new ones, no expansion of the old. On paper, it is crisp. Article 1 bars military measures. Article 2 guarantees science. Article 3 requires the sharing of information and personnel. Article 5 draws a hard line through anything nuclear. But like all crisp things, it frays at the edges when it touches weather and will A clause explains that military personnel and equipment may be used in support of science and allowance as practical as it is elastic. Another clause permits inspection at any time. Observers may visit stations, ships, and aircraft, a kind of perpetual audit intended to keep the ice honest. The map that results is not a fortress, but a house with windows cold, bright, and, in principle, transparent. And yet the timing gave the signatures a haunted feeling. Outside the conference room, the world was partitioned, Berlin poised for crisis. Cuba not yet, but soon. Missiles already a thought that could cross oceans. Why would superpowers that fenced each other everywhere else suddenly agree to keep an entire continent as a quiet library? The conventional answer is persuasive. Antarctica is expensive, cruel, and logistically absurd. A war there would be blood and bankruptcy for little gain. The treaty thus functioned like a truce against folly, codifying an instinct already strong among those who had shoveled snow at the bottom of the world. There are some places where rivalry is merely stupid. But the treaty also used a sinuous instrument process to domesticate the unknown. From 1961 onward, the parties would meet and meet again in consultative gatherings, translating snow into minutes and protocols, forming committees with names that sounded like muffled footsteps in a corridor, scientific committees, environmental committees, bodies to coordinate logistics. The continent became a kind of polite fiction, empty on the census, but busy in the filing cabinets. And in that bureaucracy, some heard not virtue, but secrecy, the sense that the most valuable commodity in Antarctica was not krill, not coal, not even ice, but information itself. For the public, the pact's noblest promises traveled alongside its most frustrating realities. Yes, anyone could, in principle, conduct science. Yes, results were to be shared, but access still required permission, transport, money, time, and tolerance for risk. Flights were scarce, ships scarcer, and the continent's operational calendar short. A researcher could spend years securing a berth on a plane, then hours above a weather that might suddenly erase the runway. The openness felt conditional. Antarctica was a public archive with a locked reading room. Meanwhile, the treaty's freeze-on claims functioned like a spell. Disputes did not vanish. They were merely suspended. Flags still fluttered at old bases. Maps in certain capitals still used a favorite shade to tint a particular wedge of the white. The words without prejudice appeared often, the legal incantation meaning we have not forgotten what we believe is ours. In the background, naval icebreakers, military in their bones, scientific in their paperwork, cut channels to resupply stations where radar dishes turned and weather balloons rose, and the difference between research and reconnaissance lay as much in intent as in hardware. If the treaty was a promise, the Protocol on Environmental Protection that came later, signed in 1991, was its vow renewed in sterner language. It prohibited mineral resource activities other than for scientific research and built a protective wall around ecosystems that are at once hardy and delicate. The word moratorium is often used. The reality is more intricate. The ban has no set expiry, but after a long interval, the parties may consider reviewing it. To the hopeful, this is reassurance. To the suspicious, it reads like a clock hidden behind a curtain. What no one doubts is the treaty's practical success. The continent has avoided the permanent bases of armies. There are no missile silos under the aurora. Decades of cooperation have yielded ice cores that tell a story of ancient air, data about ozone and climate that has spurred global policy, and cooperative ventures that would have been unthinkable in other theaters of the Cold War. More nations have joined dozens now from every inhabited continent, and the architecture of meetings and inspections has, by and large, held. But success is not the same as trust. If anything, the system's efficiency has been fuel for the furnace of doubt. A regulatory regime that can keep whole fleets organized and whole summers scheduled looks to some like exactly the right machine for managing truths, releasing the innocuous, shelving the inflammatory. The principle of open inspection sounds transparent until one asks who inspects, when, and with what limits. The promise that scientific results will be shared rings clear until one asks what counts as result, and what can be classed as raw data indefinitely under analysis. Even the ban on militarization contains its own shadow transport planes still land on blue ice. Specialists whose skills are indistinguishable from the military's still build and fly and fix. Then there is the human way of reading a map. On charts, one frequently sees zones hatched and labeled for special protection bird rookeries, moss fields, historical huts, unique geologies. The designations are good science and good stewardship. Yet to a mind schooled by rumor, shaded zones look like secrets wearing green paint. Flight paths bend around weather and terrain and the dull, merciless logic of fuel. But to those watching from afar, the long arcs that aircraft take around the pole resemble corridors drawn by policy rather than prudence. When a satellite image is blurred because of sensor glitches or a snowstorm's grain, it is easy in the age of magnify and share to call that blur a curtain. So the treaty acquires two lives. In the first, it is one of the century's genuine triumphs of restraint, an agreement in which rivals ask themselves who they wished to be at the planet's edge and answered, for once, better than usual. In the second, it is a masterwork of control, a velvet rope strung around an iceberg to keep crowds from seeing what only the invited may see. Both readings thrive because Antarctica itself trains us to think in paradoxes. It is the most open and the most closed of continents, a place where outsiders may arrive only in tightly managed seasons, and where the sky on a clear day offers a horizon so long it feels like permission. Whether you choose the first life or the second, the treaty becomes the hinge between exploration's wild century and the era of management. It is the instrument by which the continent's enigmas were funneled into committees, and the paper that allows a scientist from one country to sleep under a roof built by another while the wind tattles at the guy lines. It is also the prelude to suspicion's next act. For once, the world has declared a thing protected. The very protection can look, if you tilt your head, like concealment, and in the whiteness that follows, the imagination begins again. In the end, the ice hands us back a portrait of ourselves. We first imagined Antarctica as a counterweight, a necessary land to balance the known world Terra Australis drawn to make the globe feel asymmetrical. Sensible? Complete? Then we went south in wood and canvas, later in the steel and aluminum, and discovered not balance but ordeal winds that flatten tints, light that refuses to set, darkness that refuses to lift, And still we kept going, carrying flags, notebooks, and that quiet superstition that meaning waits where maps run out. Antarctica obliged us by being both a fact and a fable, an atlas entry and an echo. Across the centuries, it has mirrored our obsessions. Medieval map makers shaded in a southern land to finish their round world. Enlightenment navigators turned it into a puzzle to be solved, latitude by latitude. The so-called heroic age staged 3 lessons in character: Amundsen's tidy calculus of preparation, Scott's costly fidelity to ideal, Shackleton's life-first leadership. The 20th century threw a grid over the ice and found in the emptiness a convenient mirror for power. Air corridors, coded cables, and careful treaties followed. In our own day, the satellite age has put Antarctica in everyone's palm and yet, somehow, kept it out of reach. The ice itself keeps the minutes. In bubbles of ancient air, we read atmospheres no living witness breathed. In the dust, caravans of deserts we have never walked. In ash layers, volcanoes that roared before we counted years. Core by core, a patient film of warming and cooling spools into our hands, oceans inhaling and exhaling, glaciers advancing and retreating. Here we learned the cadence of carbon's rise and the grammar of the ozone hole. Here we test our models against record that does not flatter our hopes. The archive is vast and legible, and also stubborn, reminding us how easily we mistake the recent for the eternal. Knowledge never arrives here untouched by desire. Science travels with logistics, and logistics with budgets, aircraft, manifests, radio frequencies, agreements. The continent runs on the practical magic of schedules, flight windows, fuel caches, convoys on the plateau, sea ice tables, cargo strapped and counted again and again. We call it cooperation, and it is. We also call it control, and it has to be. Survival demands a choreography that blurs the line between openness and oversight. In such conditions, even truth must wear a parka shared. Yes, but handled, escorted, sometimes delayed. Earlier we traced the triangle that holds the curtain science, the military, and belief. Each can be generous, each can be a mask. Science clears a path through ignorance and sometimes erects fences in the name of method. The military lends engines, runways, and emergency craft to fragile projects and, inevitably, its reflex for classification. Belief, liturgical or secular, lays parables over the ice and calls them maps, insisting that meaning beats a faint drum beneath the gale. Together they have given Antarctica a second landscape made of rules, briefings, and the stories a superstructure hovering over the rock, the snow, the sea, the continent's deepest work, though maybe to school us in limits. You cannot command a katabatic wind shouldering down from the plateau, sand blasting a snow into glittering smoke. You cannot bargain with 3 months of night, nor with 3 months of day. A dog team learns this with aching hips. A tracked vehicle learns it with shattered bearings. Even satellites learn it when charged particles lace the sky and instruments hiccup through the polar night. The ice is a slow tutor, but thorough. It does not shout. It repeats the lesson until the student is quiet enough to learn. Because we are small, the choices ahead loom large. Shelves at the ocean's edge calve with the groan of breaking cathedrals. Valley glaciers retreat and expose stones last touched by sunlight before cities had names. Thwaites and its neighbors have entered our vocabulary like new characters in a family saga, reminders that a contour line on a map can become a shoreline for someone's home. As ice thins or shifts, more of the archive we came to read will appear: fossil leaves with their patient veins, sediments that spell out the speed of past seas, waters sealed away since before our languages took shape. Then comes the other temptation to turn discovery into extraction. Deep in our stories runs a bright thread of treasure, the idea that beneath the white lie seams and fields, reservoirs and veins that might slacken the world's hunger. Perhaps there are, and perhaps technology will one day propose terms that make the vault look negotiable. If that day comes, the arguments will arrive wrapped in emergency fuel for hospitals, metals for batteries, work for cities, lifelines for fragile economies. Against that urge stands another emergency: older and harder to market stewardship, restraint, the resolve to leave certain pages of the Earth's great ledger unread. So where does that leave us at the end of this long white corridor with questions, as honest histories tend to? What is the right speed for knowledge when the subject is fragile? Who owns a measurement taken in common air above land claimed by everyone and no one? How much secrecy is prudence, and how much is vanity dressed in a parka? When does myth obstruct, and when does it keep us tender to the scale of things we do not yet understand? These are not Antarctic questions alone. They are global ones, concentrated by ice into something crisp enough to hold in the mind. There is one answer the continent offers without ambiguity. It is in the way sound carries on a still day across kilometers of nothing, making a distant shovel ring like a bell. It is in the dry valleys where almost no snow falls and rocks lie with faces sandblasted clean, as if set out for inspection. It is in the aurora when it folds and unfolds like a slow book being opened. The answer is humility, and the practice is attention. Antarctica resists spectacle by being a spectacular. It resists ownership by making every visitor a beginner. It turns bravado into carefulness, and carefulness into care. So we end where we began, with a blank place that was never blank, with silence that is not empty but eloquent. In a noisy century, the continent keeps its voice low. If there is a revelation here, it is not a treasure map to hidden cities or a vault of perfect fuel, but a discipline of looking and listening that we rarely grant ourselves elsewhere. The ice does not hand us truths. It sets the conditions under which truths can be found slowly, with companionship, with patience for winter and gratitude for the brief extravagance of summer. Antarctica remains. It asks little and changes us a great deal. If we come south at all on paper, in person, or only in thought, let it be not to break the last quiet thing on earth, but to keep it company. The restlessness we carried here may soften. The hunger to master may yield to the steadier appetite to understand, and when we leave, as everyone must, perhaps we will carry some of that hush home and make good use of it in louder latitudes. The ice will be here, telling time in its old, patient way, reminding us that not everything must be owned to be known, and not everything must be solved to be worthy of love.